This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then Notes on Resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month.
Because if I have too much assertiveness and not enough empathy to go with it, now I'm maybe very dominant. I might be taking over meetings. I might be just doing what I want that meets my needs without any consideration for my audience or the impact on anyone else. But if I have too much empathy without the assertiveness, I may be somebody who's too tenderhearted. I have a hard time giving feedback when someone needs to hear it, or I don't delegate as much because I worry people are already overworked, so I don't want to pile on, and my assertiveness isn't there to meet it.
Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. My guest today is Jen Shirkani. She's an expert on emotional intelligence and a speaker and an author, and she talks about how can we leverage the power of emotional intelligence. And we had a fabulous conversation today where we talked about EQ, resilience as an outcome, and a little bit about her conversations with some super survivors and what she learned from them. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Hey, if you like the podcast, find us on Apple Podcasts. We'd love for you to subscribe and leave a review. And I've also got a Google form with a few questions just to get your feedback. Find out what you like about the show, what you think we could do better. There's a link for that in the show notes. Thanks and enjoy the show. Hello, Jen. I'm so excited that I'm going to be talking to you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Before we let our listeners know who you are and why you and I are talking today, I would like to know if you could have any superpower, what would that be?
I would love to be able to time travel.
Mm-hmm.
That would by far be my favorite thing. One, I'd love to go into history and watch certain events unfold in real time and imagine what life is like in those times. But even just nowadays, to be able to fly somewhere and just blink and be where I need to go and not have to worry about airports and airplanes and schedules being on time and all that, I would love to time travel. That would be my number one thing.
Absolutely. I'm with you on the just wanting to blink your eyes or wiggle your nose and be somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, time travel, is there a particular event that you would most like to see in the past?
Honestly, this is probably going to sound crazy, but I would love to have gone back to 1775, 6, somewhere in there, and gotten to see the founding fathers and maybe sat in the original Congress and see what their ideas were and what they envisioned for the future of the country. And I just think that would be the coolest thing to have been able to see and understand more about.
Yes, because historians interpret what the intentions were. It would be amazing to be there and hear what they were really saying and what they were really thinking about.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, let me know when you do that, please.
Okay, I will.
When you figure out how to do that and come back, I want to know. Thank you for sharing that. Mm-hmm. So why don't you tell our listeners, who are you and what do you do?
So I'm Jen Shirkani, and I specialize in the application of emotional intelligence and the resulting resilience that comes from that. We work with organizations. So I primarily work on the business side versus, life coaching or personal, and work with executives and leaders around the country, now actually around the world occasionally. And we really just help everybody better understand themselves, have a little more self-awareness, how well they're managing their social relationships or social awareness, empathy, and then how do they respond appropriately? How do they take action that is best suited for the situation they're in or the audience they have, and be a little bit more mindful about their own behaviors.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm curious, can you explain what you mean when you say emotional intelligence?
Sure. So this is a behavioral science. It's fairly new. I mean, when you consider all behavioral sciences or even assessments that are on the market, this is much newer than personality, for example, or communication style. And really, this is based on a history of study that started with a clinical psychologist, and he was the one who coined the term EQ, or emotional quotient. Sometimes that term is interchangeably used with EI, or emotional intelligence. And really what it comes down to is someone's ability to better understand themselves. And when they face a struggle or a hardship, do they see that as an opportunity to learn about themselves and others? Or do they allow that experience to permanently damage their sense of hope for the future?
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so that's really kind of the early studies around emotional intelligence, or EQ. The way I define it is, like I said, someone's ability to recognize themselves, knowing strengths, knowing weaknesses, knowing moods, and how those moods might be affecting the way we think or act, reading others, reading the room, reading the audience, and then responding appropriately and using some self-management skills to think about how they want to respond instead of letting emotion take over and sometimes undermine us, or just kind of having a one-size-fits-all approach. Those with lower interpersonal adaptability tend not to use as much emotional intelligence.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. From the way that you're describing emotional intelligence, I'm thinking there are some real serious connections between resiliency and emotional intelligence. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So EQ ends up being a very solid foundation for having, almost like resilience is the outcome of having more emotional intelligence, because it really helps you better recognize, when am I feeling stressed or anxiety about something, and what am I doing to help myself manage through some of that stress or anxiety to prevent it from getting to a point where now it's leading to a health consequence or something I'm not in control of. And then it also really helps understand perspectives of others. So if I am faced with something that's a hardship that's going to require me to have some resiliency, I'm able to see it maybe a little more objectively. Like, this isn't just happening to me. This isn't something that is directed at me uniquely. This is just a bad situation that I find myself in. And that can really help us maintain, like that idea of hope for the future, that this is not forever. This is a situation that I'm in and it will get better. And so having the optimism, which is one of the EQ skills, is another component of resiliency. How do I self-motivate in a way to stick with the situation, but have the optimism to know this isn't going to last forever. I will get through this.
Right. How do you measure emotional intelligence? Is that something you can get maybe what we would call an objective measurement of?
Yeah, it's interesting because it is measurable, and there is the assessment that's kind of been around the longest is called the EQI 2.0. And It was initially offered as a self-assessment. So I go online, I answer 133 questions about myself, and it gives me an actual score. So I have a numeric measure tied to my overall emotional intelligence. And then it also measures 15 EQ skills and how I'm doing on those 15. And then years later, another assessment came out, which was really built around Dan Goleman's model of emotional intelligence. So Dan Goleman was really the first author that took on this behavioral science and analyzed how it worked in the business world. You know, what does it mean to have a leader with higher emotional intelligence, and what are the consequences of that? And so he developed, in partnership with what was then Hay Group, it's now Korn Ferry, what they call the ESCI, the Emotional and Social Competence Inventory. And that measures 12 EQ skills. But they have a very strong philosophy, and I'm certified in both of these assessments, so I've used them both regularly. But the Korn Ferry version feels very strongly that you can't rely on a self only, because we all have biases or blind spots about us. And so they only offer theirs as a 360, which means you take it, but then all the people in your circle around you also take it. Mm-hmm. So you get a very clear picture of the way I see myself compared to how everyone else scored me in these 12 areas. The EQI has since added a 360 option. So they have come back and added that. But the Hay Group or Korn Ferry version, they won't offer a self only because they don't feel it's as valid. I personally use both, and I see validity and benefit to either one, just depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish with the assessment.
Wow. Okay. So it is measurable, which I suppose, does that also mean that resiliency would be a measurable trait that we have?
Yeah. You can actually, there's an assessment called the hardiness indicator, and it does measure resiliency. It's published by the same company that does the EQI 2.0. So I've used that resiliency and hardiness gauge. I think it's called the HRG. And again, it's a self only. So it's really just a matter of you kind of identifying what situation are you strongest in, and do you have what it takes, you know, to overcome setbacks or struggles. I think all of them, though, what's really important is that self-reflection and the self-awareness piece, you know?
Yeah. Because I was wondering if I took a self-assessment or an assessment that said, oh, you are this resilient in whatever this, you know, whatever the scale may be. I wonder what would I do with that information? And so I'm curious, emotional intelligence and maybe taking the resiliency assessment as well, but how is that useful to somebody to know that information about themselves?
It's really helpful to understand our behavioral patterns. And I think one of the values of that is, are there situations where I am not helping myself? You know, one of the values of self-awareness is knowing what brings out the best in me, but also what might bring out the worst in me. And so if I can do a better job picking roles, companies, cultures, leaders that I know bring out the best in me, I am helping myself, right? In the one area that I might have control over, which is just me and my behavior. I can't control the world. I can't control anything happening outside. I can only control me and my reactions to things. And so understanding what is my go-to reaction. And what I find when I'm coaching people, especially I coach a lot of mid-career, you know, or late career executive leaders, there are certain things that we get known for, whether it's because it might be a skill that comes naturally to us. So let's just say it's problem solving. I might be a great problem solver. And so I do it a lot at my job. And other people now start to rely on me for that problem solving. But at some point, if I overuse that skill, I'm not encouraging anyone else to do any problem solving because they're bringing everything to me. And, or it's my automatic response when there's times people don't want me to solve their problem. They just want me to listen. They just want to brainstorm. They don't need an answer. And so a lot of the coaching work is don't add this new skill in or change this behavior, but stop doing this so much. Start pulling back and balancing out. So another pairing I look at on the EQ assessment, one skill of EQ is assertiveness, and one skill of EQ is empathy. Well, the goal is that I have these two in balance, because if I have too much assertiveness and not enough empathy to go with it, now I'm maybe very dominant. I might be taking over meetings. I might be just doing what I want that meets my needs without any consideration for my audience or the impact on anyone else.
Right.
But if I have too much empathy without the assertiveness, I may be somebody who's too tenderhearted. I have a hard time giving feedback when someone needs to hear it, or I don't delegate as much because I worry people are already overworked, so I don't want to pile on, and my assertiveness isn't there to meet it. So I need to have these two in balance.
Yes. Now, this, as you're talking, this is so interesting. I'm thinking, I have done assessments in the past as part of corporate jobs that I've had. And that is the milieu that you are talking about. That's the world that you work in. But this isn't something that people in other kinds of jobs often, or other kinds of situations, necessarily would have access to or even know that they existed. So I feel like we're creating this one set of people who build this awareness and understand maybe their resiliency level and their emotional intelligence and what they may need to work. And then other folks who might not naturally be thinking in those ways, who don't have a sense of what's going on, and, maybe doesn't have a sense of what's holding them back and can't see that. I wish this was the kind of, I don't know, I guess I wish this was something that was more easily available to people, or somehow we could all just know these numbers or where we fit on the scale, so that we could all figure out how to relate to each other.
I know. It would be so nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I say hats off to organizations that see the need for this and are willing to invest in this for their employees, because one of the things that we see, benefit wise, even though, I've been in professional development and learning for over 30 years now. And it used to be these skills were treated as the soft skills, the nice to have. We had extra budget money in training. We'd give them a little workshop on communication, but it wasn't really seen as like critical, vital, functional skills. And I've been impressed, I think, as the years have gone on, that people are starting to see how much more important these skills are getting, because my IQ will only get me so far. My technical expertise will only get me so far. But at some point, I have to work through other people.
Right.
And in today's world, we have even lower independent work. A lot of work is collaborative. People have to work on teams, or they're interdependent, department to department within an organization. So these functional skills start to become really important. And so organizations that figure this out and start treating these as importantly as getting people through an Excel class or a compliance program, they realize these are going to be just as important to my workforce to have these skills as their technical expertise.
Right. Well, wouldn't it be great if we taught them younger?
It would.
Before we got into the workforce? Not that I want to put more on teachers' plates.
Yes.
They're responsible for a lot of things right now, but okay. So what do you think people misunderstand most about the concept of resilience?
I think, it's interesting because resilience to me, in a lot of cases, is an outcome, or it's something you say upon reflection that you might have. Because I think when we're in the heart of something difficult, it's very difficult to say, oh, I'm feeling so resilient today.
Yes. Yes.
oh, look at all my resilience I'm using today. It's like, no, I'm just getting through the day today,
Mm-hmm.
But in hindsight, when you look back on it, there is sometimes perspective that says, wow, okay, I got through that. I'm not quite as scared to face a similar situation in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually learned something about myself or
Yeah.
somebody else as a result of that. And I'm always so impressed with what I call the super survivors out there. And I think of people like Michael J. Fox,
Mm-hmm.
who has been through a tremendous health difficulty for many, many years, kind of pulled him out of his prime.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, every time you hear him talk, and he writes books about gratitude, and he will say, this is one of the best things that ever happened to me. And you think, my goodness, who could have that perspective on such a debilitating health ailment? But yet he has figured out how to make the best of the situation and has discovered parts of him and the people around him that he doesn't believe he would have ever known or seen if he hadn't gotten sick. And so I think that's a big part of this concept of resiliency is, can you look back on it and say, in the end, I'm better for this happening?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I like your thinking of, it isn't something you're necessarily thinking in the moment. Let me now call on my resilience. It is something that you look back and realize that you had.
Yeah.
So I guess that begs the question, how can you build resiliency if it's this not necessarily something that you call in the moment that you need it, or that you consciously call in the moment that you need it? So how do you build?
Well, I mean, I think, I hate to say, but it's like stress, right? Moderate stress builds stress tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
So a big challenge, I think, with resiliency, or a lot of times when we're called to be resilient, is when change has occurred, typically unexpected change or change that's out of our control.
Yes.
And so I find that the people who have kind of the best foundation of resilience are those that are somewhat challenging their own comfort zone voluntarily.
Okay.
They're willing to make change or push for change on their own. So they're comfortable or more comfortable with change. And one of the elements of emotional intelligence is flexibility, that open-mindedness to do new things or try something different. And I think that ability to say, okay, it's looking like we're going to get a new software at work and I know nothing about it. You can either wait until the company rolls it out and then puts everybody through training and try and figure it out then, or you could start to do a little research on your own, maybe look at a tutorial, start to think, okay, I'm going to start familiarizing at least myself with this. Right. Or, somebody invites you to a networking meeting or a party or a social event, and they end up last minute canceling. And then you have that decision. Do I go by myself or do I just bag it because they're not going, my friend's not going with me? And that person who's willing to go and face maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable social setting where they know nobody is challenging that flexibility, and they're building some of that change openness to try new things. And, that starts to then open up their eyes to what else might be out there. They might have an experience that it ended up being a really positive experience for them. So now they'll be more resilient next time to maybe try to do something on their own they've never done before.
Right.
So it's like a muscle in a way, and you push yourself. And I always say, we're much better when it's something like that, where I'm totally in control. If it really sucks, I'll just leave, early.
Right.
If it's really bad, I have my car, I'll just get out of there. And so you have control still over what you're doing to push yourself, but you're willing to really, bite the bullet and go do that.
Right.
People talk about making presentations at work. A lot of people are afraid to present in front of others. And so really pushing themselves to give a presentation or give a talk. that's a challenge for a lot of people. And the ones that are willing to do it, learn from that. And then next time they're not quite as intimidated to do it again.
Right. Right. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And we have been talking a lot about personal traits. How can I build my resilience? Lean into the discomfort, for example. What do you think? So I am someone who firmly believes in personal responsibility. I'm responsible for how I respond to something. I'm responsible for my actions. But what do you think is the role of our organizations or our systems in helping people and in really supporting resiliency?
Yeah, it's definitely a two-way responsibility because, you're right. We have to be responsible for our own actions and what we're doing and saying and what we take away from that experience. And then, there's also the leadership side and how do I build a company that can withstand struggles and hardships? And I think a lot of it is the whole, what am I learning and what have I learned and what would I do differently next time? And our organizations tend to be really future minded. Everything is like, what are we doing this quarter to meet our goals? What's happening? What are the goals for next year? Everyone's now getting ready to start budget season for 2024. If they're on calendar fiscal. And so I think there is a tendency to look very forward. And when there has been a mistake, there's a quick tendency to want to just say, okay, put that away. We're never looking at that again. Like, I just want that behind me and I never want to think about what happened there. When I think organizations can stop and do a better job of dissecting, okay, this did not work for us, whether it's a market launch failure, a change initiative that didn't work, something that didn't go the way they thought it would. Can we have an honest discussion about what went wrong so that we can benefit from that learning so that we can hopefully prevent that same thing from happening again? But there is a lot of, as a lot of concern about, I don't want to point fingers. I certainly don't want the fingers pointed at me. So I'm not about to go into a meeting and admit I really blew it on something. And so it's just easier to sweep it under the rug and move on and focus on the next goal.
Right.
But that's one really good way that organizations can build some resiliency is by making it okay to take a look back and do an autopsy report of here's how this project went. Here's what we learned, good and bad. Here were some successes, but here were some failures. And then how do we use that information to be better in the future?
Right. Okay. Cool. I also think about organizations, say the company that you work for or another group that you're part of as being supportive or being not particularly supportive. And I guess what I'm thinking, so I want to just quick back to the Michael J. Fox story because he is amazing. His story is, I think, inspirational. He is also someone who has access to a tremendous amount of resources to bring to bear on his situation. And that isn't able to heal his illness, but it does enable him to perhaps tap into resiliency in a way that's different that somebody with fewer resources could have. So I guess I'm thinking about organizational support on that kind of level, that if you are working for an organization that isn't supportive of emotional intelligence and resiliency and recovery from trauma, that's very different from working from an organization that is very supportive and empathetic and compassionate. I guess I'm curious your thoughts on what I just spent a lot of time explaining.
Well, I guess there are certainly advantages, right? If you're lucky enough to be in a large enough company that might have additional resources around an EAP or a very good health insurance plan, and perhaps even some support groups inside the organization. So a larger company, typically you'll see more of those types of supportive stuff. And then you've got a bunch of small companies that just can't practically offer those things.
Right.
And so I think it's really important to tap into the network in your community, in your social circle, perhaps, or in your home circle that can provide some of those missing pieces out there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because one theme I noticed when I was studying these super survivors, and I looked at people like Elizabeth Smart, who faced a really difficult year when she was kidnapped and then eventually found.
Yes.
And I think everywhere I looked, when I saw people who had survived really challenging life situations, there was an element inside every one of their stories around charity. And what I mean by that is giving back in some way, whether that was a foundation, which is Michael J. Fox. He has a foundation now to prevent Parkinson's, or a drive, a resource gallery. I spoke to one woman whose son was actually killed as a teenager in a violent incident. And the kid who killed her son was also a teenager. She ended up talking to him when he was in prison, stayed in touch with him. And when he got out of prison, she took him into her home and finished raising him.
Wow.
I know. I mean, you just can't imagine some of the things that people have done. But again, there's this giving back. I want to help others who have gone through similar scenarios, so I can, tell them my story and give them any tools I might have, and then perhaps build some kind of resource for this ailment or plight or whatever the situation is.
Right.
And so I think it's a really valuable component that even when we feel we need all the help and we need all the resources, these people are still saying, but I still have something I can give back.
Yeah.
And when you have that mindset and when you take those kinds of actions, I think you naturally find then your tribe, your support team will show up. And so it becomes very reciprocal then.
Right.
And it's a wonderful thing. So I think it's easy though to feel alone, and feel like maybe I'm the only one going through this. But the reality is, that's usually not the case.
Right. And it can be hard to find the other people, depending on what it is that you're going through, because we don't always want to talk about the things that we're going through when we're going through them. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And we are getting close to the end of our time. So I'm curious, what is giving you hope right now?
It's definitely challenging times. And, there is I think at our core, human beings are resilient. I think it is in our just core nature to want to thrive and overcome and endure. And so I think the human spirit is very strong. And even though we've definitely had our challenges, and there's a lot of challenges in the world overall, I still believe in that human spirit. And I see people who learn about emotional intelligence, they internalize it, they make different decisions with their life, and as a result, see very different results. And it can be life-changing. It's why I was really drawn to this science, because I thought, we have a lot of professional skills that we can develop and teach people, but without this foundation, this EQ thing, this ability to recognize, read, and respond, and the resilience that comes from that, it doesn't really do me any good if I'm not learning and growing along the way. So I see a lot of benefit. I think it's like, it takes that hard coding we all have. We all have a hard coded set of traits or temperaments, but this just helps make us better. It's like the magnifier for bringing out the best in us, like I said, and maybe minimizing the worst of us through this self-awareness and decisions I make accordingly.
Yeah.
And that gives me a lot of hope.
Nice. I like it. I like talking about hope. Because things can feel a little oppressive these days for a lot of us. So what would you tell your 18-year-old self about resiliency?
Oh, man. That old saying our grandparents told us, patience is a virtue.
Yes.
the older I get, the more I'm realizing how true that is. I think my 18-year-old self was quite impatient. And I think there is a lot of messaging that goes to our youth about, you only live once and life is short. And what I have learned is that for the vast majority of us, life is long. Mm-hmm. Life is actually long. And even though I had times in relationships that I was not happy, times that I didn't like my job, that I didn't like my body, that I didn't like my bank account, remembering that it's not going to last. This isn't forever. We think it's forever. I think when we're young, we think, I'm never going to love this person again. Yes. I'm never going to like this job again. I'm going to hate my body forever. The reality is that's not the case, that things will absolutely change and your mind will change accordingly. And you've got a lot still left to go here. And so remember that decisions you make now could have consequences for decades to come. And so, be a little more patient with things and believe a little bit in the system working itself out. And sometimes we're just feeling something that's temporary and it doesn't mean it's going to be forever. So that's, I think, what I wish I had thought about back then. Many, many, many mistakes ago.
Just thinking the same thing. I think my 18-year-old self could have benefited from some of these words as well, if she had listened.
Yeah, well, that's it, right? Because of course I tell this to my children and they're like, yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Jen, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. And I really appreciate your perspective of someone who thinks about and works with people on the concept of emotional intelligence. And I'm going to put the information in the show notes, but what is the best way for our listeners to reach you?
Oh, you can email me and my email address will be in there. It's jennifer@penumbra.com. And I have, videos and websites and free assessment samples and things like that. So if anyone wants more information on the resilience, hardiness gauge or the EQI or the ESCI or any of those, just reach out. I'm happy to share any additional resources. And I have a whole article series on my LinkedIn page and a blog. So we got lots of free stuff for people who want to learn more about this.
Oh, great. And I'll put links to your social accounts and your website and everything so people can find you and maybe start taking some of these assessments and figure out their own emotional intelligence. Jen, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinsky, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.